Thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein. I have 40 years experience helping people with rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, devised by Albert Ellis. And you can find my practice link and book link, 3-Minute Therapy, in the description below. And my partner these days is David Ramsey Steele. David, would you want to say a few words of introduction about yourself?
Yes, I write books, and I've co-written with Michael a couple of books about psychotherapy, but I write books on other topics. I've written a book about George Orwell, and my latest book is a collection of my previously published essays. It's called The Mystery of Fascism, David Ramsey Steele's Greatest Hits.
Okay, very good. And David and I wrote 3-Minute Therapy together, and we also wrote Therapy Breakthrough together. So that's why those are my best two books. Today we're going to discuss perfectionism. And perfectionism is a problem involved with many major emotional and behavioral disturbances people have, including anxiety, depression, relationship problems, and addictions. And as you know, if you're familiar with rational emotive behavior therapy, familiar with Stoicism, and familiar with how emotions work, our emotions, like an emotion of and behavior of perfectionism, comes from our thinking, our beliefs. So it's not doing poorly, for example, on an exam that leads you to be perfectionistic, but it's the ideas in your head, what you tell yourself about doing poorly on the exam, such as, I absolutely should do perfectly on this exam, and because I got one question wrong, I'm no good, I'm a loser, I'm a failure. So it starts with the demand and ends with a global evaluation. Now, perfectionism could be pointed at someone else. My partner, my friend, my teacher, my manager should treat me perfectly. And if they don't, they're no good. They're rotten people. And then to finish the triad, perfectionism could also involve the conditions of your life, the situation you find yourself in. My life should be absolutely fair, hassle-free, interesting, exciting. And if it's not, then my life is awful and I'll be miserable forever. So those are some of the beliefs that cause perfectionism. And some of the disadvantages of perfectionism are it tends to lead you to feel anxious in trying to accomplish something, which tends to cloud your thinking. It leads to procrastination, because if it's not going to be perfect, then you have a perfect excuse to procrastinate because you think it should be perfect. And it leads to relationship problems. My partner should treat me perfectly well, never get angry, never lie to me, or act addictively or treat me poorly. And if he or she doesn't, then that means they're no good, they're rotten, and that leads to anger, resentment, and hostility. There is a difference between the goal of perfection versus perfectionism. So if you have a goal of perfection, to do something perfectly, and not a demand, I must be perfect, but I strongly prefer to be perfect, then that could be motivating. So it's fine to have that as a goal, and that would lead you to work hard and be more motivated. But as soon as you escalate the preference into a demand, into a must, because I prefer to be perfect or act perfectly, and it would have many advantages, therefore I absolutely must. So your preference is okay. There's nothing irrational about your preference, which could be motivating, but making it into a demand, a must, a law of the universe tends to lead to emotional disturbance and the problems I mentioned. It also tends to lead to get the opposite results. If you're perfectionistic, then since getting anxious, guilty, depressed about not having done perfectly or the possibility of not doing perfectly will tend to degrade your thinking, and then you'll do much less than perfect. Now, there are various goals you could have that are reasonable, but if you make them into musts, they become unreasonable. So you could have a goal to be average, normal, just like everyone else. But if you make it into a must, then I must be average, I must be normal. And I have many clients who felt this way. Everyone else seems cool, calm, and collected. I'm the only anxious one here. I should be normal. Or my life is a shambles, and everyone else, of course, leads an organized, productive life, and I should be have a normal life like everyone else. And then moving on to more competence, I prefer to do well, and therefore I absolutely must do well. So that's not as bad as I must do perfectly well, but as long as it's a must, it tends to get you into trouble. Or I prefer to do outstandingly well, and don't make that into a demand, then you get anxious. And then the worst goal to have, if you're going to make it into a must or a demand, is I must do perfectly well. And Oscar Wilde has been reputed to have said, if it's worth doing poorly. So that has some wisdom into it. By the way, David, do you know if that's correctly attributed
It
to
does. I don't. I'm sure it would have been more elegantly phrased. I don't know that that's a Wildean epigram actually.
I see. So it would be interesting to see
But it
who
is. But
first
of
said
course,
that.
it's very true. And a lot of Wilde's epigrams, he just takes a common saying and reverses it. For example, work is the curse of the drinking classes. And then it carries a lot of truth in it. And basically, the corollary of saying if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing well, is if you can't do it well, you don't do it. And so this leads to people becoming paralyzed, unable to get anything done because the conditions are not quite right, or they don't feel they can do a perfect job.
As they must.
As they must, yes. And there are things that have evolved, practices that have evolved to sort of counter this. I mean, one is that many writers set themselves the task of writing a certain number of words every day, say 5,000 words a day. And at first glance, that seems silly because they may not be feeling very well on a particular day, or they may not have great ideas. But in fact, it's a good discipline because, first of all, you don't know how well what you write is going to turn out. And this is true of in many other walks of life. So when you get stuck into writing, sometimes you surprise yourself. But also, if you're always waiting for the perfect conditions, then you tend not to get anything done. And so it becomes instrumental in procrastination that people will say, well, I'm not going to do this because the conditions aren't quite right. Like I'm not going to work on this particular project because I feel a bit tired. I'll wait until I feel wide awake. And that sort of thing is destructive. Really, it's a perfectionism is paralyzing effective action.
Yeah, I must have the perfect conditions before I'll write. Or I must have an idea of the perfect thing to write before I write, as you said, David. And that reminds me of something I read about Ernest Hemingway. He said that the way he gets to write, and he writes every day, or he wrote every day. And he said, I'm going to sit down and write for an hour, even if it's gobbledygook, but I'm going to put in that hour every day. So that's certainly anti-perfectionism.
Yes.
And another thing you can remind yourself is another saying is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So you can do something well, but not perfectly well, and it's certainly worth doing.
Right. Right.
So the bottom line here is keep reasonable desires to perform well, even perfectly well, but don't make it into a demand. Then you may perfectly sabotage yourself.
Right. Right.
Any last words, David? Anything else you'd like to
No,
add here?
I think you've said quite a lot there. I think that's all worth taking very seriously.
Okay, very good. Well, if you enjoyed the episode, please comment below, give us a like, give us criticism, also suggest subjects, and we always like having a volunteer to discuss a problem on these podcasts, so feel free to volunteer. And to help support us, please donate to Patreon and subscribe to the 3 Minute Therapy podcast to stay on the rational side of life.